the interesting thing about my story is not how I tried to kill myself. The interesting thing about my story is what led up to it. What were those factors? Being in an abusive relationship, living in a house where there was severe addiction. And then what happened after, my situation with the first responders, my situation in the hospital, how I healed, how I taught myself new coping mechanisms. That's the interesting part, and they don't want to hear that. I think the thing that convinced me to want to keep living was my experience with the hospital, my experience with first responders. It was bad. It was not the worst I've heard of, but there was no compassion there. There was mostly silence aimed at me. It felt like resentment. So I sat there for a long time thinking about what I'd done, with my little dunce cap, and the experience of trying to die and being led through that hospital situation made me realize something needed to change. Everything needed to change. It's about constantly being cognizant of what helps, and also what hurts, and avoiding that.
There were most likely several factors that impacted my son's decision to die. In hindsight, I can see those. At the time, I couldn't necessarily see them. His sophomore year, he told me that he was suicidal, his sophomore year of high school. And we got him some help, but it seemed to go away, he seemed fine. And he took his life at the end of his senior year. It was right after he graduated high school, actually. And when I look back, I can see things like the anger that was playing out that I didn't realize was a sign of depression, the drinking that was potentially there because he was trying to deal with depression, bad coping mechanism. He was taking medication for acne that had a side effect of suicidal ideation. He had a friend that had taken his life a year prior. Actually, one of the last things my son said through that night, he had been tweeting, was R.I.P. in this boy's name. So there were several factors that went into my son's decision to take his life.
There was a lot of dark and stormy night language, and the reporter insisted on using my method. And he said, well, it's non-disclosure, and if you don't tell me, I'm going to pull it.
When my son died, there was no immediate media coverage. There was coverage starting about 18 months later, as I started to find my voice in this space. And I've been in the newspaper and on the news several times. And when I think about some of those reporters and what went well and what didn't go well, initially I would say most people got a B. The TV interviews in particular got a B. They would say things like commit suicide, even though I tried to encourage them to say died by suicide. So it's in their vernacular. So sometimes that didn't go so well. But generally it was okay. It was okay. They didn't try to, how do I want to say it? They didn't try to simplify his suicide. They talked about a variety of factors. And the first few interviews, I would say they did a nice job of including the suicide prevention hotline number and really casting a vision of hope.
Live Through This is a series of portraits and stories of 170 suicide attempt survivors across the United States. I'm always talking to people on Twitter about suicide, about resources. My Twitter and Facebook feeds are constant. I schedule them in advance. I pre-write tweets with resources, with images.
A few days after my son died, a woman whom I barely knew that went to my church came to visit me, and I knew her as the woman whose son took his life. I didn't know when he did it. I just knew that's who she was. She came to visit me, and she didn't have anything magical to say. She sat with me. She cried with me. She let me ask her really horrific questions, details about it that I needed that for whatever reason. I needed to hear from somebody else that had the same horrible story, that they were still moving along. And I didn't know it at the time, but she did plant seeds of hope that day. And as the months went on, I started thinking about, what do people do that don't have the kind of support that I had? Franklin County LOSS stands for Local Outreach to Suicide Survivors. We launched in November of 2014 by going to the coroner's office and talking to them about the importance of trained volunteer survivors of a suicide loss being there to support people that are left behind after a suicide. And after some work, the coroner's office was agreeable to us being called out to support people. And we've been doing that now for 2 years. And ultimately, we're there to be an installation of hope to the folks that are left behind. So over the past 2 years since our LOSS team launched, we have been on approximately 80 scenes of suicides in the Columbus area. And then we've supported, even beyond that, hundreds of people beyond those scenes. On another occasion, I had a reporter from a newspaper call me and express an interest in riding along with some of the volunteers when we get called to the scene of a suicide to support people that are left behind. And I was pretty adamant that that was not going to happen. And his secondary question was, well, would it be okay if I interviewed you right after you were there? And I said, well, what kinds of questions would you ask? And he was prepared to ask questions like method and race, age, information such as that. And that was just absolutely unacceptable. And I would go as far as to say that during this conversation, this reporter bullied me and really shamed me for not being willing to share things like method, because that was so basic that I should know that and I should be willing to share that. And he threatened to go to somebody else for a story, and I said that that was fine, and that is what he did. He ended up going outside of our community to a team who does a similar service and spoke with them for the story.
Good for you.
He gets an F. One of the things that really came across loud and clear was that he was just doing his job. He didn't talk to me as a human being, as a mom. At one point during the phone conversation, I said, you know who you're talking to, right? My son died by suicide. I'm a mom. He had just been saying such cold things and just treating this clearly like it was his job, and it was really hurtful. And the more he talked, the more I closed up.
It's almost ironic that journalists, of all people, forget the power of language. With the topic of suicide in the media, what we should be doing is drawing back, being careful with our words, not necessarily censoring our words, but being careful with our words.
If the media were to do a story right now and they left it completely up to me, a story about my son and my son's suicide, the story would be certainly about his life and not just about how he chose death. But most importantly, it would include the basics like how to help a friend who's feeling suicidal. Don't be afraid to ask the question, are you thinking of suicide? I'm worried about you. People need permission to have those basic conversations, and I think a good media story would include that.
What I want journalists to know is that the stories that they're covering about suicide are about real people, and that they should take the lead from those people. I think journalists have a lot of power, and I think that we as normal everyday people have a lot of power. So I try to spend a lot of time educating people about that. That you do have the power to save a life, and it's very simple. It's so simple as to be counterintuitive. You just have to start with asking a question. Do you want to kill yourself?